Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 780 for August 11th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
I want something that's super interesting or something that's like the best version of that, like what you think that whiskey always wanted to be. But you also put your name on it whenever you pick that barrel. And if you built a good reputation, you don't want a bad barrel to hurt that, just so you can have another single barrel. You know, I think, everybody sitting at this table is lucky enough to buy as many barrels as we want. So we're not going to put a bottle on the back bar that we wouldn't want to drink regularly.
Private bottlings used to be fairly rare, but now it seems like every liquor store and bar has their own single cask or two, or more. I was in Louisville Tuesday night for one of Michael Veach's Bourbon Salon events at Oxmoor Farm, and he brought together some of the region's leading bourbon bar owners and managers for the evening's discussion, with an entire segment devoted to barrel selections. We'll have the unvarnished and uncensored discussion later on WhiskyCast in depth, and I'll share my tasting notes for one of the barrel selections they poured during the talk too. That's just ahead, along with the calendar of events, behind the label, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and more. All on this episode of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Pernod Ricard's U.S. acquisition spree is on. The company's latest deal for Firestone and Robertson Distilling in Fort Worth, Texas, is the second this summer, following the acquisition of Kentucky's Rabbit Hole Distilling in June. The deal includes Whiskey Ranch, where Leonard Firestone and Troy Robertson built their distillery on the former Glen Garden Country Club and golf course. As far as we know, it's the only distillery with its own golf course, or the only golf course with its own distillery. No purchase price was announced. Firestone and Robertson released its first Texas blended whiskey in 2012 and added a straight bourbon in 2016. Meanwhile, Suntory Holdings is investing another $56 million in new warehousing for its whiskeys in Japan. The Nikkei Asian Review reports that construction will begin in November on a new 40,000-barrel warehouse at its Omi facility east of Kyoto. Work is almost complete on another warehouse at the site and is scheduled to be completed by the end of this year. And Diageo has received the final planning permission for its massive upgrades on visitors' centers at many of its distilleries in Scotland. Murray Council has given its approval for work at Cardew Distillery in Speyside. That clears the way for construction work to begin later this year. Cardew's upgrade is being tied into the new Johnny Walker experience that's being built in Edinburgh, which will also tie in the centers at Glenkinchie, Kleinleach, and Kalila distilleries. This coming weekend, Finland's Kuro Distillery will open its new distillery to the public for the first time, even though there is still some construction work left to be done between now and the end of next month. Distiller Kalle Valkonen told me this week that he and the other founders decided to start the project 2 years ago after visiting distilleries in Scotland.
We were looking at the beautiful distilleries around there and thought that if we really want to bring the Finnish rye whiskey to the map, we need to take very big steps in our production. And so we decided that instead of doing a small expansion on the existing site, we will build a completely new distillery into the building next to the existing distillery. So we've been planning since, and we started early this year building exactly. And in the first step, we are looking at a production of 300,000 LPA a year only for the whiskey.
So this will let you, several years down the road, really start to meet some demand for your whiskey then, right?
Yeah, hopefully. And because we don't know exactly what's the demand going to be in the future, so on the new side, we can still triple the production when we add some wash packs to the site.
So you've got room for future expansion then if you need to, right?
Exactly. And the new distillery, we've got a set of pot stills, 9,000 and 7,000 liters.
This Saturday's grand opening coincides with Kuro Fest, the distillery's annual day-long music festival. They're also celebrating Kuro's gold medal for its rye whiskey in the recent International Wine and Spirits competition. And speaking of ryes, Wild Turkey is releasing the 4th edition in Eddie Russell's Master's Keep series. Cornerstone Rye uses barrels from 9 to 11 years old. It's bottled at 54.5% ABV. Only around 16,000 bottles will be available at a recommended retail price of $175 each. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at whiskycast.com. And Whistle Pig is out with its oldest whiskey yet, an 18-year-old double malt rye. The mash bill includes both malted and unmalted rye. It'll be released annually on a limited basis each year for around $400 a bottle. Other new whiskeys announced this week. Brook Laddie is releasing 3 new single malts in what the distillery is calling its Barley Exploration series. The Organic 2010 single malt uses single estate barley from Midcool Farms in Inverness, while the Beer Barley 2010 uses heirloom beer barley grown on Orkney. Both whiskeys were matured for 8 years in ex-bourbon casks. The Isla Barley 2011 uses barley from 6 different farms on the island. It's a 6-year-old whiskey matured in a combination of ex-bourbon and European oak wine casks. All 3 are bottled at 50% ABV. They'll carry recommended retail prices between £55 and £75 in the UK. Bowmore is reviving an expression for the Chinese market that made its original debut in 2006 with the Sea Dragon. Now the 36-year-old Dragon edition is being released, using whiskeys from the same batch of ex-sherry casks as that original version. It'll carry a recommended retail price of $2,000 a bottle. Tomatin Distillery is relaunching its Kubakan peated single malt as an experimental series. In addition to the flagship signature version matured in a combination of bourbon, Oloroso sherry, and virgin American oak casks, there will be 2 new additions, or creations as they're being called. Creation number 1 is matured in a combination of Imperial Stout beer and Muscatel wine casks, while creation number 2 uses Japanese shochu and virgin European oak casks. All 3 are bottled at 46% ABV and will be available worldwide with UK pricing of £45 for the signature and £60 each for the 2 creations. Michter's is releasing a brand new whiskey. Its US 1 Toasted Barrel Sour Mash whiskey is a follow-up to previous Toasted Barrel versions of its bourbon and barrel-strength rye whiskeys. The Toasted Barrel Sour Mash is finished in those toasted barrels after regular maturation in standard barrels. It'll sell for around $60 a bottle in the U.S. and will be available in limited export markets as well. And Buffalo Trace is honoring the late, great Elmer T. Lee on what would have been his 100th birthday last Monday. The distillery is releasing a one-time-only bottling of Elmer T. Lee 100-Year Tribute Single Barrel Bourbon. It's also bottled at 100 proof or 50% ABV. If you can find it, the recommended retail price will be around $100 a bottle. Back when Buffalo Trace released a special bottle in 2009 for Elmer's 90th birthday, part of the proceeds went to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 4075 in Frankfort, Kentucky, where Elmer was a longtime member, and that'll be the case with this year's release as well. Let's turn now to a more somber subject, the aftermath of last weekend's mass shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. And we're going to focus on Dayton, where a lone gunman killed 9 people and wounded 14 others outside a bar in the city's Oregon Entertainment District before he was killed by police 30 seconds after his rampage started. The shooting spree took place about 3 blocks away from Joe Head's Century Bar. Century Bar has long been regarded for its whiskey selection, and it's a popular spot for whiskey lovers visiting Dayton. I had the chance to discuss the shooting and its aftermath with Joe the other night in Louisville.
We did lock ourselves down for about 30 minutes till we knew what was really going on. One of my younger staff members was in the area that it happened, and he's real shook up, So we have felt it and see it, and it's terrible, but it's 2019, and we hate that this is something we're kind of, as Americans, have gotten, I don't want to say used to, but it's it's just, it happens so often. So it's weird how the aftermath is. The aftermath, I think, has really been another struggle for everyone in the community, because now we have trucks and tents and garbage from all these media outlets. So when it's in your own community, I think you see the weird effects of the aftermath and how it really affects people. And I mean, for the most part, I believe it's really made us come together as a community. I mean, we've had a rough year. We had the tornadoes on Memorial Day, then the Monday night Memorial Day that devastated the areas, and even worse, it devastated some of the poorer areas, the areas that really couldn't take it. It hit that, and then we're struggling to get back on our feet, and then you have this terrible. However, I don't think you'll ever see a mass shooting get handled as quickly as that night. I mean, I think our police engaged them within like the first 30 seconds. So, I mean, the loss of life that they prevented is, I mean, if that kid had gotten in that bar, there was 600 people in there, and this would be a different conversation. So, I mean, our police, we can't say enough about the job they did. I know people don't always appreciate law enforcement, but in a time like that, I mean, it was crucial to not having a much worse situation.
3 blocks away, it could have just as easily been outside of your bar.
You hope not, I mean, our bar doesn't really cater to younger people as much as that area of town does, and it seems to be that it's younger people that are doing those sorts of crimes. So I hope that, we always hope it wouldn't be us, but I'm sure everyone over there thought it wouldn't be them as well. So
how do you try to prevent something like this from happening at your bar? You can only have so much security on the door.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We have real no need for security. We have our Bill works our front door, and he's more of a maitre d' than he is anything else. I mean, sure, he's making sure people are of the right age, but I mean, we don't need security. Yeah, I hope you never need it, but those bars over there all had security, and, their door guys all block the doors from that guy getting in, and, I mean, they put themselves first, so, I hope that's something I never have to do, but I would never, but I don't guess anyone would expect it. I would never expect that sort of thing to be an issue for us.
But you never would have expected this to happen in Dayton, Ohio, of all places.
But I mean, I guess no one in Columbine thought their high school was going to get shot up, so it's just it's a weird and strange times, and we're all just trying to navigate it as best we can, I believe. I mean, I don't know what the answers would be, how you could ever stop something like that. If someone really wants to do bad things, I just don't know there's a way any of us could do anything about it.
We'll hear more from Joe later on WhiskyCast In Depth, and our thoughts are with the people of Dayton, as well as El Paso, Gilroy, California, and so many more cities struck by mass shootings. And finally, we have some new data on the rising popularity of distilled spirits. The Gallup Poll has been asking Americans for many years what they drink most often, liquor, wine, or beer. Beer has almost always been number one, except for 1 year in 2005 when wine was more popular. But this year, whiskeys and other distilled spirits have reached their highest point ever at 29%, essentially tied with wine at 30%. That's up from 19% 20 years ago. And for the record, beer remains number one at 38%. And here's where it gets interesting for whiskey and spirits lovers. 32% of the women surveyed prefer spirits, compared to 26% of men. And spirits are almost just as popular as beer among young adults. Now, Gallup only breaks out ages by 18 to 34-year-olds instead of 21 and older, but 39% of young adults prefer spirits, compared to 41% who pick beer, and just 16% who prefer wine. Gallup also did not ask those who preferred spirits just what kind they prefer. Full disclosure, I worked as a broadcast producer for the Gallup Poll earlier in my career. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. I'll be hitting the road later this week and making the long trip to Australia for the first time. As I mentioned last time around, I've been invited to visit Starward Distillery in Melbourne, but we are going to start off the trip in Hobart, Tasmania, as Tasmanian Whiskey Week wraps up this coming weekend. I'll be at the Tasmanian Spirits Showcase this coming Saturday afternoon in Hobart, and I've already heard from some of our listeners who plan to be there. And we're also going to have some time available for meetups in Melbourne and Sydney next week. Since schedules can change at the last minute on these trips, please keep an eye on our Twitter feed for details on those. And, of course, we'll have more on the next episode of WhiskyCast from Hobart, too. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. In addition to Tasmanian Whiskey Week events all week long, Whiskey Live Adelaide is coming up on Friday and Saturday as well in Australia. Sagamore Spirit Distillery in Baltimore hosts Whiskey on the Waterfront on Saturday. Villa Conthor in Limburg, Germany has a whiskey dinner on August 21st. And the Bourbon Women's Annual Symposium Conference is in Louisville, Kentucky, August 23rd through the 25th. Heading into September, Spirit of Speyside Distilled is in Elgin, Scotland, September 6th and 7th, along with Maltstock in the Netherlands from the 6th through the 8th, and the Scotch Malt Whisky Society's Gathering 2019 at the Vaults in Leith, Scotland, the 7th through the 9th. The debut of the Hometown Rising Country Music and Bourbon Festival is in Louisville, September 14th and 15th, followed by Bourbon and Beyond the 20th through the 22nd. Of course, the Kentucky Bourbon Festival is in Bardstown from the 18th through the 22nd. Right now, we have 214 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just use the search button to find events near you or wherever you may be traveling soon.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Heaven Hill whiskies have been distilled with inspiration and aged with patience for more than 8 decades. Now it's time to share the stories behind those whiskeys and the people who make them. Download and listen to the new podcast, Tales from the Hill, from Heaven Hill Distillery. You'll find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. Bar owners face a lot of challenges, and the best find ways to set themselves apart from their competitors. One of those ways is by offering something no one else can, their own private bottlings of some of your favorite whiskeys. The other night, bourbon historian and Hall of Famer Michael Veach focused one of his Bourbon Salon evenings at Louisville's Oxmoor farm on the topic of great bourbon bars. His panelists were Larry Rice of the Silver Dollar and Margo McMillen of Bourbon's Bistro, both in Louisville, and Joe Head of the Century Bar in Dayton, Ohio. We heard from Joe earlier during the news. They pour 4 bourbons during each Bourbon Salon, 3 current whiskeys, and a vintage one from the collection of the Bullitt family, which owned Oxmoor Farm for generations, and should not be confused with the Bullets of Bulleit bourbon fame. You may notice occasional audio issues during the discussion. That's because this is the first time that a Bourbon Salon has ever been recorded. We're presenting this segment with only minor editing, and that means if you're listening with kids in earshot, be aware that there is some adult language in this segment. There's a topic for each bourbon, and the topic for this segment was barrel selections. They poured Joe Head's Century Bar selection of Wild Turkey's Kentucky Spirit. We'll let Mike take it from there.
We're tasting Kentucky Spirit that was picked for the Century Bar by Joe and I guess some of his crew?
No, just me and Eddie.
Just you and Eddie.
I found that you get way better picks if you don't take a bunch of people with you. It's all about relationships.
Yeah. So that's what I'm going to lead off with in this question. And this is the Kentucky Spirit. What was the proof on it? 101?
101.
Yeah. So barrel selections are often offered to bars and everything, and I know all 3 of you all have done them. Let's just talk about it. What do you do? What do you look for in a barrel selection and such?
I think the barrel selections can go either way. And every crappy failing bar now, as I'm sure we all know, just slaps a bunch of bourbon on their back bar because that's what. Well, Century's busy, or Silver Dollar, or Bistros, or Bourbons is busy. So there are a lot of copycats, and that's how you separate yourself from them now, is making good barrel picks. Most of the times, like, I hope this is the best version of Wild Turkey 101 you've ever drank. That's kind of the goal. Every now and again, we go off the reservation and try to get something spicy. But, like we have a couple spicy Eagle Rares, but that kind of bites you in the ass a little bit. And that people who drink Eagle Rare, if you go way off the flavor profile, does that put the normal drinker off of it? So who you're trying to sell that to at the end of the day? We've done 48 barrel picks. And I think it's important to do barrel picks. And I don't know how much longer that will last because not everybody's doing barrel picks.
Though, what you said about the Eagle Rare, but to me, that's one of the points of a barrel pick. It should taste different from the regular Eagle Rare. Otherwise, why not just buy regular Eagle Rare?
Right.
So I really love that. One of my favorite barrel picks I've ever tasted is from Larry here at the Silver Dollar. He talked Heaven Hill into doing a JTS Brown bottled and bond single barrel, and it was some of the best whiskey in the world. I think he still has some at the bar, but probably not a whole lot left because I talk it up.
I've got some at the house, but none at the bar.
Okay.
But I'll share.
I think Billy and Molly and I all shared his JTS when we were all down here the last time.
Oh, okay.
We all took a turn surprising each other and buying the rounds.
So What about the rest of you when you do your barrel picks? Is there anything in particular that you're looking for? It's interesting because I was once told, by a local liquor store, I won't say who, that you don't need to put good whiskey in your barrel picks because no matter what you do on your barrel pick, it's going to walk off the shelf. And my answer to that is it'll walk off the shelf a couple of times and until people realize you're giving them crappy whiskey, and then they're not going to buy your barrel picks anymore.
I always tell new bottles or distillers, new distilleries, I always say, we'll sell your first glass, but you got to sell the second glass. Exactly. If it's not any good, I can't help you after that. Like, the first glass is always going to get bought, but that second glass has to be good juice.
Yeah, I think your barrel pick should be like a premium bourbon that just exceeds.
It should be worth that extra $1 or $2 that you charge for the pour.
Yeah, I don't think it should just taste like the regular Eagle Rare just because it's, we have a special that we all picked out. I don't think that should be the selling point. The flavor and the profile of what you picked out, I think, will sell the rest of the bottle.
When you don't know till it gets home.
Absolutely not. It tastes different.
You leave excited and you get home, you're like, oh.
Yes.
So, what's the process of getting a barrel pick?
Well, first of all, you got to get on the list of the distillery to do it because there's so many people wanting to do it now. They only have a certain number of barrels that they allow for barrel picks and everything. But once you get on the list, I'll let one of these guests talk about it. They know more about doing it, getting on the list and doing it than I do.
What goes back to what Joe said earlier, it's all about relationships. You obviously have to have a license to be able to purchase because it has to go through a distributor. And clubs do it by teaming up with like a liquor store, package store, or whatnot. But it is harder, especially with any, I think everybody gets the same, distilleries in mind when they're thinking about barrel picks, and those guys are all sold out basically. They, at the beginning of the year, they have X number of slots and these days picked out, and then they'll send you over a list of dates to pick from, and you pick one, and you better show up. And they're really good about keeping those relationships in the sense that you don't get knocked off the list. But they're not adding new people on. But newer distilleries like New Riff and people like that are still actively taking on new accounts.
Yeah, and we have reached out to the new distilleries to do our barrel picks just because we want to expand, and we're on all those other lists. We've done the major picks from all the major distilleries, but Jason is actively, and he is on lists to do the new Rabbit Hole and the new Riff, so we can experience the selection process at these young distilleries and see how they do their things. New
Riff is really cool in that I'm really good friends with those guys because they're obviously the closest distillery to me. Yeah. So I do a lot with them. I always say New Riff is bourbon nerds making bourbon for bourbon nerds. Mm-hmm. Nobody else is ever going to do a non-chill filtered, bonded only. They've set a nice standard, and they do a cool thing where they'll sell quarter barrels. Yeah. I've tried to get them to split quarter barrels into 4, take one, put it back on a shelf, in a year, take another quarter of it.
I get told no a lot too.
Yeah, I get told no. Hey, if you don't ask, they can't say yes.
That's right.
Yes, I got married.
Back in the back.
Let me ask you, these barrel selections, they probably only give you a certain number of barrels that you can try, and then you have to select out of that. And then the second part of my question is, where in the rick house are they pulling those from? Is it in the middle section, the lower section? Where are they pulling?
Everyone does it differently. I'm sure we all would agree. We know some distilleries give you 3 barrels, some give you 4, and if you don't want them, the guy behind you will buy 2 of them. And they're not really trying. Now, I always say that this spirit, for me, my personal opinion is Russell's or Wild Turkey does it the classiest version of a barrel pick of anybody. If you leave Wild Turkey unhappy, that's your fault. There's 30 barrels on the floor, all selected by the master distiller, and he's standing there right next to you.
And he'll drill too for you. He'll walk through the rick house and drill.
I have had one pick where I went down by myself, but he didn't know I was coming by myself, and he he was tickled that I came by myself, and he didn't like how Ohio treated me. So he rolled off every barrel off the rick. We didn't taste anything on the ground. He and I were the only two people who had ever tasted that whiskey that day. And I mean, that's special.
Yeah. And to your point of having to pick between those three, you don't. Like I always tell people, I'm coming to taste to see if I want one. I'm not coming to buy one necessarily. And I have turned down the offerings they've done, and in the scenarios where that happened, they actually pulled more barrels out until I found one I was happy with. But I'm, like back to the original question about what you choose, like I got almost identical philosophy with Joe. I want something either super interesting or something that's like the best version of that, like what you think that whiskey always wanted to be. But you also put your name on it whenever you pick that barrel. And if you've built a good reputation, you don't want a bad barrel to hurt that, just so you can have another single barrel. I think, everybody sitting at this table is lucky enough to buy as many barrels as we want. So we're not going to put a bottle on the back bar that we wouldn't want to drink regularly.
Well, Bill Thomas, last January, I guess it was, we did a program here on collecting and old bottles and such. And he was saying that private selections are going to be the next really big collectible. People are going to go around looking for the best private selections and buy bottles of it.
Right.
It's happening now, I think.
Yeah.
Good question, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
To that point, so how often do distillers come to you for those private selections, and how many do at once? Like, I'm just trying to understand if you're at a place to sell this to consumers, how often is it, what's the frequency? The growth of how many?
I feel like we go to them and ask them.
Yeah, at this point, I think most of us probably already just have an arrangement. Every year we're doing whatever
So
barrels
many.
they are, and then we might reach out to the new people, or a lot of times they reach out to us.
Usually in January, like, so for Buffalo Trace, for instance, I know for us, that every January, I get like, here's what you got chose to buy this year, or however that works.
Yeah.
And then you just kind of get in there when you can. Like, I picked my Weller and I refused it. Whenever I tried to refuse it, they put it back up for me because the 114 wasn't available yet, but they knew it was coming.
They did that for me.
But it
too,
put me in the back of the line.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I still haven't got mine.
Yeah, I haven't got mine either. But I picked two that day. We did a Weller and an Eagle Rare. I don't like doing it that way. I'd rather make the trip down twice. It's a little wonky picking two barrels in one day. I don't like that. But then, so we picked we picked our Eagle Rare, our Weller, and our Buffalo Trace in January, February, but we don't pick Blanton's till October.
Yeah.
So it's based on your volume of what you sell?
That keeps you in good graces, for sure. But, the kicker is they don't include, when we buy private barrels, they don't add that to our normal purchasing. So, if we're buying a 200 bottle barrel, they don't count those 200 bottles as like that. Those weren't counted as 150 Wild Turkey 101s. But my business partner drinks Wild Turkey, so we're good.
And it's not.
They're not doing this during normal release time because they're so damn busy with release, right?
Well, they do them every day.
Yeah. Every day.
Every day, 2 a day, 3 a day sometimes. Okay. Because some people want a whole thing, a tour, and I don't want a tour. I know, I get it. I've seen it. It's great. I just want to pick a barrel and leave. You could do 10 barrels a day the way I do it.
I might disagree with you about the most unique barrel selection. Interesting one. I really think the Maker's Mark Private Select is probably the most unique and interesting.
Larry and I were just talking about that, but the price point.
Yes.
We got to sell this stuff too. I mean, they come in at it's a pretty premium price point.
We haven't picked the Makers in a long time because we just sold the last bottle.
I still have some.
From the last time.
It's a hard sell.
It's a hard, and you have to mark that Private Selection Maker's Mark.
Yeah.
I don't know that Maker's Mark drinkers really are looking for an interesting bourbon.
Yeah.
They like
They like Makers and Coke.
They like Makers, which is perfectly fine bourbon. Don't get me wrong, but it's not.
Absolutely.
It's not really moving the stick. That's why they don't do Makers single barrel.
Yeah. Okay, because it's pretty. Yeah. Their whole business plan
It's
is
perfect the way it is.
Consistency.
It is interesting, though. You're right. It's like bourbon calculus.
Right.
Yeah.
Palate fatigue is real. When I left there driving back 71, my tongue was behind my cartoon banging off the highway.
You're not making 10 of those in a day.
The record, the last time I did a selection there, they said the record for the person that stayed there and went through the most combinations You'll never guess who it was. Mike Miller from Delilah's. By himself.
Wow.
I think they said that he filled out 3 books before he made a selection.
We did 12 before we finally. Our 11th one we liked, but it was their spring gift shop release.
Really?
Oh.
They're like, well, we don't care. I'm like, I've come this far.
Yeah.
Question?
So the Maker's Mark Select, that's the one where they let you put the 10 other states.
Right.
So how does that concept compare to the just, picking your barrel concept?
It's a totally different animal. So the single barrel is obviously just a single barrel. That's how it aged. That's what it turned into, and you pick it out. This is a batch of makers that's already of age, and then you play around with samples of each individual stave, and they portion it out for you to see how much it should be compared to what they think it's going to extract from the others. So you actually manipulate the maker's barrel, whereas you just buy the single barrels. So it's not really, that's why they call it private select as well. It's not really a single barrel. I guess it is once you re-barrel it, but it wasn't originally.
Yeah. So it's more a designer taste versus this.
Yeah.
Right.
It's fun for people, because they get to have a little bit of manipulation with it, but and it's also like their whole stick has always been consistency. Makers is makers, it's the same. And they didn't want to compromise that with a bunch of off barrels or slightly off flavor profile barrels. And, makers drinkers are pretty loyal, so, and they're loyal, like they all went nuts when they dropped 2% off to get some more volume, so that they didn't. So now it's something different. Like they're trying to get a different market, I think, than with the private selects and with the 46 than what they already had with just regular makers.
So you guys are saying you have problems getting more customers for that type of thing?
It's expensive. It's a really
very
expensive
product.
And because of the way they do it, basically they dump all the barrels. You pick your barrel, pick your thing.
No angel share.
Yeah, they take the barrel apart. They put the staves in, put the barrel back together, and fill it. And it only rests in that cave for 6 weeks?
6 weeks, yeah.
6
So no
weeks. So
angel
there
share
is
at
no
all.
real angel share. So you're getting a lot of bottles. You're
Yeah.
getting 250?
Yeah.
You're getting a
It's
full
a- it's-
53 gallons.
Yeah.
back.
Right.
It's like doing a tequila barrel.
What I think the proximity of our bars to where it's made to has a lot to do with it not selling great. Because I've got buddies in California, New York, it flies off their shelves there. And now I'm actually doing a barrel soon again, and I'm not out of mine yet. But when friends that aren't on the list to do that want to share a barrel, I'll do that now. So that way they can get some. It'll fly off their shelves, and I like those relationships with other bar owners and bartenders. But
Nice to meet you, friend.
I'm already doing the makers this year with somebody else.
Well, and Larry does have one advantage over someone like Bourbon's Bistro in that you have the Pearl, which also has a package license.
Yeah.
So you can actually sell a whole bottle of these private selections if it's not moving fast.
It does help.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's take our next break, and we'll be pouring the Old Granddad 114.
Ooh, so good.
Thanks to Mike Veach, Joe Head, Margo McMillen, and Larry Rice. And I'd also like to thank Shirley Harmon and Doug Elliott of Oxmoor Farm for helping us with production logistics over the last few weeks. By the way, the next Bourbon Salon will be on October 8th and will feature a discussion with women in the distilling industry. There is also a Repeal Night Bourbon Salon event planned for December 5th. A limited number of tickets are available for both events. You'll find links for them in our calendar of events at the WhiskyCast website. That's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit bottling that Joe Head picked for the Century Bar in Dayton. As with the regular Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit, it's bottled at 50.5% ABV or 101 proof. The nose has soft spices, honey, vanilla, charred oak, brown sugar, and a hint of cocoa powder. The taste has black pepper and cinnamon spices, balanced nicely by honey, a hint of leather, cocoa powder, brown sugar, and vanilla. The long finish has spices that fade away gently, with hints of brown sugar, honey, vanilla, and dark chocolate. It's one of the best Wild Turkey bourbons I've ever tasted. I'm giving the Century Bar's barrel of Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit a 94. Got a sample the other day of Old Forester's 2019 Birthday Bourbon. It's an 11-year-old bourbon bottled at 52.5% ABV. The nose has notes of tobacco and leather, along with hints of clove and black pepper, while honey and vanilla provide balance in the background. The taste is peppery with a slight citrusy tartness. There's black pepper, along with hints of clove and chili powder, that complement touches of honey, vanilla, lemon zest, pipe tobacco, and toasted oak. The finish is long, slightly astringent, and subtle. I'm scoring the 2019 Old Forester Birthday Bourbon a 93. Amaranth is historically referred to as the grain of the gods. Buffalo Trace recently released the Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. Amaranth Bourbon. It's a bottled-in-bond bourbon using amaranth as the flavoring grain, along with corn and malted barley in the mash bill. And, of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose has a subtle mintiness along with touches of black cherries, honey, vanilla, and chocolate fudge. The taste has a good spiciness, balanced by honey, vanilla, cocoa powder, and a hint of butterscotch that leads into the finish, which is nice and long with touches of honey, oatmeal, and spearmint. I'm scoring the Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. Amaranth Bourbon a 91. And finally, let's look at the Maker's Mark 101 Proof Traveler's Edition. As we reported recently, this made its debut last year in global travel retail, but is now available at the Maker's Mark gift shop in Loretto, Kentucky, and selected Kentucky retailers. It's bottled at 50.5% ABV. The nose is aromatic with notes of caramel candy, toasted oak, honey, and vanilla. The taste is smooth with subtle spices that build up to a nice peak, along with hints of caramel, honey, dark chocolate, and dried fruits in the background. The finish is long with lingering spices and a slight tartness. I'm scoring the Maker's Mark 101 Proof Traveler's Edition a 92. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at whiskycast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Had several comments on last week's interview with Uncle Nearest Whiskey founder Fawn Weaver. Jordan Oler emailed this comment: "What a great episode with Fawn. She made wonderful points and told a great story. She sounds like a remarkable person to talk with over a dram or three. Looking forward to visiting the distillery if I ever get there." Longtime listener Ken Goldenberg had this to say in his email: "Of all the episodes I've listened to over the years, I think this most recent one about Nearest Green was one of your best and so timely. As someone who myself is more conservative than I am progressive, I so appreciated that Fawn Weaver told a story of friendship and collaboration between Nearest Green and Jack Daniel. It was an ugly time back then for sure, and with so much negative things being said right now on both sides, it's so refreshing that she's focused on the positive side of these two great men of whiskey history. I only hope a movie is made of this, but hearing about Fawn's tenacity and her background, I'm sure that will be coming soon. I should note that, as Fawn told us in our first interview with her a couple of years ago, her husband is a film executive in Hollywood. And @SailorRetro tweeted, "Loved this episode. Thanks for, as always, asking important and poignant questions." Now, I should point out that she's not only a brand ambassador for Uncle Nearest in the Pacific Northwest, but is also one of the hosts of the Metal, Rock, and Whiskey podcast and the new Love on the Rocks cocktail podcast. Finally, Tuesday night I posted a photo of one of the chimneys at Oxmoor Farm with a trivia question. That chimney has a unique place in bourbon history. What is it? It did not take long for Omar Fitzel in Cork, Ireland, to tweet the correct answer. Evan Williams made the bricks for it. In addition to being a distiller and wharf master in Louisville at the end of the 18th century, he was also a brick mason. Now, Omar does not win anything except bragging rights for being the first correct answer. Sorry, Omar. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers all over the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap up the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other stuff that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And let's go back to the Bourbon Salon at Oxmoor Farm for just a minute. Now, I'm betting that you've probably been to a bar, and you have probably wondered just how they set their prices for a glass of whiskey, and why those prices can sometimes be pretty high. In fact, looking at a bar menu might even prompt you to use some of the adult language that's coming up in the next couple of minutes. Take that as a warning for those who might be listening with kids in the neighborhood. I asked Larry Rice, Margo McMillen, and Joe Head to explain how they set their prices. The answer is not as simple as taking the cost of a bottle and dividing it by the number of pours in that bottle.
Sometimes
it is that easy.
It starts that way, I think.
Yeah.
There's a scale that you pick for your normal bottles. You try to hit your margins, which is usually about 20% cost. As it gets more expensive, sometimes you'll eat into that a little bit. I'm not a control state, but I really regulated myself on how we curate our list. So I'm not going to buy every bourbon or every whiskey that gets sold. So we're never going to be the biggest list in the world. But what I do is try to curate vintages. So I get as much as I can of everything that I like every year. And then as the new ones come out, I'll raise last year's price a little bit. So that has nothing to do with my margins anymore. It has to do with my list at that point. And then also, I pay attention to what people are paying outside of the liquor store and outside of the bars, and I consider replacement cost. Because now I can't just go buy it again for $59. Now it's a $600 bottle. We don't have I won't price it at $600. That might be what I need out of the bottle now, but I'm not going to price it at a 20% cost at $600, if that makes sense. But I did run into a problem when we were first opening. We tried to be real generous with our Van Winkles. We weren't trying to have the most expensive, Van Winkles in the city or anything. But people were, every day I get a phone call from one of my bartenders, hey, this guy wants to buy a bottle of the 15-year. And I'm like, well, of course he does, because it's cheaper to buy it, every ounce of it at my cost than it is to buy it anywhere else right now. So I started just matching those prices. Like if people are paying $1,200, then I'll get $1,200 out of the bottle now, And then they quit asking. They quit asking to buy the bottles because they could just get it delivered to their door for that price. So it is like a sliding scale, at least at my bar.
Yeah, it's a sliding scale at ours as well, because being a restaurant with the name Bourbon in it, Bourbon's Bistro, if you don't have bourbon on the shelf, people get very upset at you. And we can't have all the bourbons on the shelf all the time due to many different things that are going on. But it is a sliding scale on how you price and what you have this year, and then you order it, and then you might not be able to get it next year, so we'll raise the price of that. Same as with him. So, our Pappy Van Winkles have gone up in price since we've started. It's not my favorite bourbon, but it's definitely hard to get, and supply and demand has a lot to do with how we price things.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all. It's not a charity; it's a business. I like shiny shit, and that shit costs money. So, and a lot of it is like with the Van Winkles. We were talking about. I would agree, not the best bourbon in the world, but it's probably the most popular bourbon in the world. I don't want the guy with an expense account just showing his buddies how cool he is. We get like military contractors. Those guys don't give a shit. They're not paying for it. Give us 4 of your most expensive bourbon. Well, that's not who I want to have it. I want the guy, my last few days bartending, like a 75-year-old guy come in. He was like, it was that time of year we had all the Van Winkles. We only get them so many times a year. We only get so many bottles now. And, I spent 40 minutes with him. Like, if you want this, this is the one I think you should get. When everybody likes this one, they do what you want. It's your money. And he got to 15. He was 75 years old. He never had it. He sat with that thing for like 2 hours. He was like, he nursed it. He enjoyed it. And the next day, I opened on Saturday morning, Saturday beer Saturday night, and he come rolling back in with his wife, and she said, we went to bed last night, and she said, you're 75 years old. You go back there and buy that more expensive pour. And he wanted it, and he enjoyed it, and he savored every sip of it. That's what you want that big stuff for. Last time I did this with Jason, he and I both agreed, charge whatever you have to for the Van Winkle, because if we don't have it, we're assholes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have to have it on the shelf. So you're trying to, some of that stuff you're trying to outprice point the guy who's just showing off.
Yes.
With his buddies, and he's going to pour Diet Coke in it when no one's paying attention anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason and I are in agreement. If you don't have it on there with the name like Bourbon's Bistro, it immediately is like a negative connotation associated with you, and you don't want to upset anyone, and you don't want to explain to them supply and demand.
And there's tiers of guys. There's guys like me and Larry who have more bourbon than we're ever going to really probably drink in our houses, and they just want to go to a bourbon bar and be around bourbon guys. Yeah. So they're going to get a Buffalo Trace or a Wild Turkey or an old Granddad Bonded. They get it. This is quality whiskey, and I get to be in this environment. And then you have the guy who has as much money as God and doesn't care. And then there's a guy who has no connections and money, and he's willing to pay for things that he just doesn't want to play on the internet and try to make friends with. So, yeah, it's a sliding scale is probably the answer for all of us.
Yeah.
Once again, thanks to Margo McMillen of Bourbon's Bistro, Larry Rice of the Silver Dollar, and Joe Head of the Century Bar for that explanation. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, along with the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, and the whiskey photo of the week, along with a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. I want to tell you how to never miss a single episode of WhiskyCast. All you have to do is click on the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app. That way you'll get every episode as soon as it's ready, and you can also listen to the show on your home smart speaker, too. I love hearing from you. You can always get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please join us next time around when we'll be in Australia.